Now for tonight's author feature. Amit Majmudar is a diagnostic nuclear radiologist who lives in Westerville, Ohio, with his wife and three children. With his dazzling ability to set words spinning, in his new collection, Amit brings us poems that sharpen both wit and knives as he examines our life in solitary. His previous works are Dothead, his third poetry collection, and Godsong, a verse translation of the Bhagavad Gita with commentary. He is also the editor of the anthology Resistance, Rebellion, Life, 50 Poems Now. Awarded the Donald Justice Prize and the Pushcart Prize, Amit's work has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the New Yorker, Best of the Best American Poetry, and the 11th edition of the Norton Introduction to Literature. He blogs for the Kenyon Review and is also a critically acclaimed novelist. Amit, it is a thrill for me to welcome you tonight and for Gramercy Books to host your book launch of What He Did in Solitary.
Thank you, Linda, for having me.
In conversation with Amit is Dr. Jane Zwart. Jane teaches English at Calvin University, where she also co-directs the Calvin Center for Faith and Writing. Her poems have previously appeared or are forthcoming in Poetry, Plowshares, Rattle, the Poetry Review, and Tri-Quarterly, as well as other journals and magazines. She's also published edited versions of onstage interviews with writers including Zadie Smith, Jonathan Safran Foer, Christian Wyman, and yes, Amit Majmudar. Jane, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. A warm welcome now to Amit Majmudar in conversation with Jane Zwart.
Thank you, Linda. So I'm very excited to have with me What He Did in Solitary, Amit's new volume of poems. And usually when I get a new book of poetry, I sort of puddle around as opposed to reading straight through. And it's sort of skipping around that we're going to be doing a little bit of tonight. But with the bonus, of course, of getting to hear Amit read his own poetry and getting to hear him talk about his project and his ideas. So because I was preparing for this interview, I, instead of skipping around, read straight through the book. And I want to actually start by asking you something about its structure as a whole. Throughout the book, there are these smaller untitled poems that are all in italics, and they break up the sections of the book. So each section of the book starts with one of those. They're all 8 lines, I think, except for one, which is actually the one I'm going to ask you to read, which is 7 lines. But those sections, those sort of intercalary poems, they have a different voice, I think, from the rest of the collection. And of course, you use many different voices in different poems, but they feel a little more oracular and a little less personal. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how that voice is important to shaping this book as a whole, and why you decided to structure this book around that kind of constant voice.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you, Jane, for studying the book and coming up with what I'm sure are going to be interesting, intriguing, and perhaps difficult questions. As far as, those introductory poems are concerned, What He Did in Solitary is almost, you could think of it as a collection of shorter chapbooks. And each one of those chapbooks has a theme, even though they don't necessarily, the poems in them don't necessarily have the exact same voice. And instead of doing something very kind of right in your face and being like, section 1, identity, instead of doing something like that, I thought to myself, I want to make it more mysterious, and I want to make it a little bit deeper than simply either just putting a number there or telling you what the theme of the poems is, because I felt like that would err on one side or the other. And so with those sort of triolet-like poems that I have at the beginning of each, first of all, I made sure to italicize them because I believe that typographically people process italicized language differently than normal language or boldface language. There's something slightly ethereal about these very thin, slanted characters, as though the wind is kind of about to blow them away, as if they're somehow more fragile than, or gossamer-like than regular type. And so I made sure they were in italics. And then, you know, for them, one of the common themes among those introductory poems is the question of the I, and question of like, who am I? You know, who is the person writing this? Who is the person writing all these different types of poems with all these different types, these different voices? And just as there's like the level of the book itself and the poems of the book, which is this garrulous cacophony of, you know, a solitary person, myself, doing all these voices, doing all these forms, doing all these themes, I wanted there to be a meta voice, a sort of meta perspective that's kind of looking down on it all and wondering like how all this came about, you know?
Mm-hmm. So can I ask you to read one
Sure.
of them?
Sure.
The one I'm thinking of is the one on page 79.
Mm-hmm.
Starting with Two Dark Points.
Oh, yes. So this is one of the sections. So yeah, it comes right after a section called Letters to Myself in My Next Incarnation. And then immediately afterwards, you have this italicized poem. Two dark points make the den of seeing. Me, I want to be all eyes, a vanishing point to canvas being, perspectives drawn into my seeing. If my one eye can make a we, then two black holes beyond the ken of seeing will make my eye, through art, all eyes.
Mm-hmm. And I love that double meaning at the end, make my art all eyes, right? Yeah. Or maybe triple meaning. But here I feel like is something that you've talked about in interviews before. Mm-hmm. And it's something that you've talked about with reference to your writing fiction, in addition to writing poetry. And it's this idea of sort of crossing the boundaries of self, or maybe even crossing out the boundaries of self experimentally. Right. And so the question that I'd like to ask about both what he did in solitary, but also perhaps in a larger sense, is whether there are places where you find it hard to cross into the experience or the sensibility of another person or another voice, if there's places that that transition snags for you, or if not, what it is, what kind of magic you're doing to make it happen so fluidly.
I don't know if it's magic. It's definitely something that dovetails with my ideas of spirituality and religion and my ideas of art. And so if you look at a tradition like the Vedanta, or if you go back to my translation of the Gita, one of the main themes, and this is a theme that, you know, Indian sages have been pondering for the past 3,500 years. It's, okay, I am myself, I am my own solitary self, but there are all these other solitary selves out there. What is our connection? And then there's the divine. What is my connection to the divine? What is their connection to the divine? And is it the same thing? Are we the same thing? And so, and it's realizing or understanding that oneness that is the true atonement or the at-one-ment that you seek through spiritual, you know, asceticism, devotion to the divine, devotion to your fellow man, good works, this, that, the other. And so it's that Vedantic notion of how can I realize my selfhood is identical with other people's otherhood, and that we collectively are one with the divine, right? And so where does art play into this? Where does a many-voiced poetry collection, where does a novel with a bunch of characters that don't resemble me, how does that all play into it? It's almost as though writing and voicing becomes a spiritual practice or a spiritual seeking. It is an attempt to, pursue self-abnegation or self-transcendence through voicing other people, through inhabiting their perspectives, even if their perspective is, fundamentally hateful towards myself, or towards my background or towards my heritage, or if someone is profoundly different from me in another way. The more you can enter that perspective and understand it, the more you can, if you can voice it artistically, at some level, in some way, you're easing or you're slightly effacing the boundary of yourself, the boundary of the ego. And so that involves both your I, meaning the letter I, the first person pronoun, and it involves your I, meaning your observation of other people, and eventually getting your eyes into other people's heads so that you can look out through their face, look out through their mind, at yourself, at the world. And when you get there, when you get to that point of radical empathy, radical unselving and entering someone else, you're loosening your ego to the point where eventually you will be able to merge not just with your fellow human beings, but with the divine as well. So that's all kind of on a continuum, like the artistic and the religious aspects of it.
Yeah. So that idea about art giving part of that gift, right? At the same time, I think one of the things that comes forward in your poetry is that it's not an uncomplicated gift, right? And just as art is something we wield and that we try to make belong to us, we're also subject to it in some ways, right? And so, yeah, I am going to ask you to read an earlier poem, Vocative,
Sure.
on page 19.
Yeah.
And I feel like this is a poem that gets at that sort of complicated relationship with language, where partly what you're trying to do is to master language, but partly you have the sense of language mastering you as well.
Right. So vocative goes like this. English is my native anguish. I was born here, read here, teased and torn here. Vocative, ablative, locative, alive. English was a dislocation navigating oceans. Wherever it arrived, it broke and brokered words. Little bits of Britain, pilfered, bartered, written, looted, hoarded, heard. Papa swapped a world for shiny colored beads, for dandelion seeds. We are subject verbs. The root word of my name hooks a foreign land. Long since shifted sand, books cannot reclaim. Graft of tongue, gift of dust. Mother and stranger sing the kedgeree, the everything at once you've made of us.
So to follow up, and if you could see my copy, it's full of all of this marginalia, right? But especially that last stanza, one of the things that stands out to me is the way it both holds together and pulls apart, right? So something like graft of tongue, graft of tongue means a couple things there, I think, right?
It does. It's multi, it has a lot of meanings all at once. Yes. Yeah. So like graft, in fact, phonetically, it resembles grift. You can graft like a branch, like a stalk onto another plant, which is it then grows there, right? And so it's like, so yeah, graft has a ton of meanings, and then, the physical tongue, and then the abstract nature of the tongue, meaning language. And so, yeah, it does kind of bring it together, and it also goes back to certain things earlier in the poem regarding, bartering, pilfering, looting, all of those things, all of those sort of colonial activities engaged in by this mercantile empire, this capitalist empire. And so, yeah, all those things. And at the same time, you know, that is how this language came to me. You know, this is how the language came to India. This is how, you know, that's the language that my parents studied medicine in, and they ended up coming to America. You know, all these sort of ricochets of history have brought me right here to Westerville, Ohio, you know, talking to you now about a book that I wrote in the English language, you know?
Right. Yeah. So can you talk about the kedgeree too a little bit?
Right.
And I might
Right. So kedgeree is an English word which is directly derived from the Indian languages. And we call it, in Gujarati, we call it khichdi, but it has differing pronunciations. And in English, it's spelled kedgeree, or, you know, that's how the British colonial people sort of, the British Empire, their imperial administrators picked up that word, and that's how they pronounced it. So that's how it's spelled and pronounced in English. But it's a very recognizable word. We had it 2 nights ago for dinner. We had khichdi 2 nights ago here at the Majmudar house. And that's sort of like, it's like a mix of things. It's a mix of things. And in the old days, you know, we make it pretty simply, but in the old days, I believe, from what I've read, it was, you know, it had a lot of just things that they would just throw it in there, kind of like a jambalaya or like a gumbo or something like that. And that's what the language does. And that's what the English language is. You know, The English language is very much that way. It has all these loan words from, you know, everything from Sanskrit and Urdu and everything from the Indian subcontinent. But of course, it has its ancestry with, you know, Anglo-Saxon and Greek and Latin. And I had a really interesting international adventure when I translated the Gita, because I took each word and I looked for analogous words in English, or words that had etymologies that were very similar or identical to the original Sanskrit word, and all of its meanings and connotations. And I just got this really bird's eye perspective of what an international polyglot language English is. And I think that's one of its strengths. I think its absorptiveness is one of its strengths as a language.
Mm-hmm. So this is sort of hybridity and the way that English swallows things up, but also the way that other sort of cultures and languages continue to have this insistence in it.
Yeah.
It's also something I want to talk about a little bit in terms of the way you handle form. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that's notable in this book is that you have these poems in a form that you've made up. Mm-hmm. Right? Called the Sonzel. So first, will you tell us what that is a minute?
Oh, sure. So there's, you know, it's kind of an East-West hybrid form. And we all are familiar with the sonnet, I believe, which has, you know, 8 lines and 6 lines, and then it has a certain rhyme scheme. It has a certain change of, you know, tone or theme, or just it has some sort of turn at its transition from the octet to the sestet. And then there's the ghazal, which is originally an Arabian form. It also has a lot of use in India and various other places. Persia, for example, Rumi and Hafiz wrote in ghazals. And that also, it can be a 14-line poem. It can also be longer. It can also be slightly shorter. And it has a set of pretty elaborate rules regarding it. It's composed in couplets. It has a rhyme at the end of the first 2 lines of the first couplet, of the first lines of the first couplet. It has a refrain at the end of it, and then it goes on from there, every other line having that same rhyme sound and refrain. And then in the final line or couplet, you can include your name as a sort of signature. And so I was tinkering independently with the sonnet, and then I was tinkering independently with the ghazal. And then I was just kind of like, all right, I want to set myself a challenge. I'm going to write a poem that meets the criteria of both simultaneously. Because you can have a 14-line ghazal, you can have a sonnet is 14 lines, so we're going to kind of do this. And so I did it, and then I just kind of got addicted to that form. And so I've written a bunch of them, actually.
Yeah. So can I ask you to read one of them?
Yeah, sure.
So this is in the section called Reverse Colonization. It's page 99, the Kipling Sonzel.
Oh, yeah, Kipling. He's my man. Okay, so this is Kipling Sonzel. It's a poem that simultaneously meets the criteria of the ghazal and the sonnet. When my father was young, center meant west. Crowded off the edge of home, he went west. People, like heliotropes, follow the gold. In those days, the brightest suns were sent west. Love for a son they'd yet to hold beckoned my bookish parents west. In that new world, the boy's dreams were old. He found himself born to wealth in a spent west. Quicksilver slivers globe and glint. Drop me, and drops of me flow east. Where I intend to end, there is no west, no east. All these comforts, Amit, and you're still a malcontent. There's nothing for you here. Go east, young man, go east. Thereby coming full circle in the end, right?
Yes. So talk to me about why it's named for Kipling.
Oh, Kipling was an Englishman who was born in India, and he wrote some of the finest Anglo-Indian literature there is, really. And you know, the Jungle Books. I was rereading Just So Stories with my daughter recently. Kim is one of his novels for adults. He's got Plain Tales from the Hills. He's got all these short stories. And he's got a ton of poems too. And his poems aren't necessarily stylistically in fashion now, but they're really fun to read aloud. And yeah, and so Kipling is kind of like this East-West writer kind of before the fact. Now it's very common to sort of mingle these things, bring these words into English language writing, bring these places and themes, but he was really one of the first, and he did it very well. Unfortunately, in the era of post-colonial studies, he is somewhat out of favor. And that too, it kind of gave me pleasure to kind of name a Sonzel after him, kind of as a latter day example of kind of doing what he's doing, only from the other end, kind of. Yeah. And so yeah, that's why it's named after Mr. Rudyard Kipling.
Thank you. Let me ask you to read one more section from this longer poem.
Sure.
So on the next page, 100, Immigration Guzzle. And I have to ask you about this because it seems to me like it doubles down on the form, right? It's a double guzzle. And so partly I think it's just notable for taking sort of the rules, and you know how it goes with writing, like you learn the rules, you learn to follow them, you learn the rules, and then you dare break them. And here you learn the rules and then you make way harder rules for yourself, apparently.
I did. And I look at this one sometimes and I'm like, how did I do that? But you have to understand, like, I just sat there and like just did it. And like, it wasn't hard at the time. But now I look at it and I'm like, wait, that rhymes with that rhymes with that. Like, you know, it's kind of weird, but like sometimes when you're in the zone, like things just suggest themselves and you just do it. But this is called Immigration Guzzle. And I think appropriately enough, there's space between it and Kipling Sonzel, but this too plays with West and East. So yeah, so it's good that you bring that out. So this is called Immigration Guzzle. Geography is fate. English reads from west to east. Fate is calligraphy. Arabic writes from east to west. One of two elsewheres always tugged and teased the West. For her finest, the heavens. For the rest, the East. The sailors had red beards, bad teeth, and wheezing chests. The East, assumed the Grand Vizier, would be the one that seized the West. Smallpox and Christ were fleas on this angelic beast, the West. A savage salvation, blasted, blinded, blessed the East. I knew how Western money dispossessed the East, but eagerly contracted what diseased the West. The blood in my veins, the vaccines in my blood, my East, my West, so confluent. They've made my East my West, my West my East.
Thank you. So I feel like so far, and I love this, we have been looking at sort of these poems of some big ideas, right? But I also wouldn't want people to not be aware that this is also a book that has poems of small and intimate moments, that's often sort of burgeon out into some universality, right? But small moments. And so I wondered if you would next come to one of my favorites, The Syndrome, and on page 48.
Right, and so The Syndrome is basically, I think it's a list poem. And a lot of the poems take that form of list poems. So the title poem, What He Did in Solitary, there's something called Apocalypse Shopping List. There's a poem called Kill List. And in fact, Kill List was the original title of this book years ago, like a couple years ago when I was thinking about what to call it. I was gonna call it Kill List. But I thought that that was a little bit too political. It almost would shift the focus a little bit too much onto that one poem or that one section. So I had it What He Did in Solitary. So that kind of covers all the poems. And so this is one of the poems that has, sorry.
Kill List is numbered as well, right?
Right, it is. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it goes up to 50, right? I think it does, yeah. 50 for 50 states, basically. And so this is another list poem. It's called The Syndrome. Loss of position sense on summer evenings. The finger pads becoming fireflies that brighten as they rise. Ability to manage money seriously impaired. Angry nostalgia over bygone aesthetics, girlfriends, bookstores, religious certainties. Exaggerated fear of losing sun on summer evenings, cupping fireflies, bewildered in close quarters by their own light. Loss of the sense of time when lost in words, experienced as intensely as sensations and more intensely than the times. Twilight detected in the irises. Perceived decrease in ease of run compared to last time. Loss of wanderlust, but not of lust. Rational fear of losing parent worsened by habit of subtracting parent's age from average human life expectancy even while watching parent blow out candles. Mechanical progression into future. Sleepwalking backwards on a squeaky treadmill. Loss of the poem on a summer evening as fingers lit up litter laptop keys with the yellow embers of smashed fireflies. Newfound lost feeling. Numbness of the tongue. Persistence in a dark wood of the hunt.
So this poem is a list, but it's a list of symptoms, right?
Right.
So what's the diagnosis?
The syndrome. That's the syndrome. The syndrome.
The syndrome.
Life, aging. What the Buddha said, aging, disease, death, suffering, all of it, That's it. It's a syndrome of being alive.
So do you feel like there's also a cure?
Nirvana. That's the cure. Merging into the divine, into the state of eternal bliss that is the oneness with the divine. There you go.
All right.
Other than that, you keep getting reborn and this stuff just keeps happening over and over again. Mm-hmm. You keep coming down with the syndrome. That's what happens.
So along with you keep getting reborn, let's read a little section too of Letters to Myself in My Next Incarnation.
Sure.
And it's a longish poem, so I'll ask you to maybe just read the section that begins at the top of page 73.
Sure. Is that the one like beyond the Kuiper belt?
It is.
Yeah. Okay. Beyond the Kuiper belt, at the behest of some circadian imperative, souls fluster as one off a lake of frozen mercury, and swirl back to this world, buoyed on each other's wake. They have the earth imprinted deeper than a memory. Monarch butterflies, come winter, can remember oyamels they've never settled on, deep in a Mexico they've never visited. The dead are one aurora incorporealis, shuttling between a north of water clocks, a south of water steaming away, a north of sundials, a south of hydrogen fusion. In Norway, near the equinox, the best time and place to watch the transmigratory pattern of souls across the night sky. My soul will kick the luminescence off its legs like a rescue diver shedding his jeans. I will seek my next parents among the battle dead, the glorious, the wrung sponges of young couples cooling in each other's sweat. I want a father dreaming of firecracker chrysanthemums, a blue furlong beyond his boyhood. I want a mother dreaming of a goddess on a tiger. Part of this is instinct and part of it delight. Stranger, signal me from way on down the tracks. Wave me in with orange wands, because I have been flying an eternity to land in time at last and grow the hands I need to feel your face.
So one of the things in reading this that's curious, to me at least, is often you have people asking, sort of just by way of conversation, like, what would you tell to your younger self,
Yeah.
right? And this is sort of that, but it's also, what would you tell to your future self,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
And so talk to me about this idea of having a present I, but also having a future I, and this hope that there will be things that sort of translate across the life.
Right. And that's a lot of what this sequence is about. And it's a whole bunch of poems that are it's a whole bunch of poems on the same theme, and they're all addressing my future incarnation. So after I die, become someone else, I want to talk to that person. And basically, I think that one of the poignant things about living again is the knowledge that you were someone in the past, you had things that you loved, you had someone you loved, people you loved, and they too may have died and been reborn, and you may not even know who they are. You may cross them at any time. You may cross someone who was your lover or your wife in the past life, and you wouldn't know who they were, and you'd be strangers to one another. Or would you? Or would something in you trigger and be able to see that person? And is that what love at first sight is? Is love at first sight recognition, right? And so I think it was Plato who used to say that, you were not actually learning new ideas. We're just remembering ideas that we knew in our past lives. And, is love like that? Are things that we like that? I mean, I know that I was obsessed with literature from a very, very early age. And not just books, but like really, really old literature and old, scriptures and things like that. Is that momentum from a past life? And that sequence of poems explores all of that, because that's stuff that I think about a lot. And so there's a poem there that's kind of about like my wife, and it's kind of like, we have to wait for each other when we're in these new bodies, and we have to love each other again. Basically, and basically, that's kind of what that sequence is about. And I think that it's this weird brotherhood or siblinghood that you have with your future self, that you don't know that person, and yet you know that person better than anyone you know, because that is you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So before I ask you to read one more poem and talk a little bit about it, I do want to just remind people that if they have questions, they can put them in the question box, and we would be I'd be happy to pass those along to you. I think also if they already have favorite poems in the book, you might read a couple more for them if you are feeling generous that way. But because at the end of this book, and you talked about there being these little chapbook like sections, I feel like the end of the book is its own sort of small world. And there are a number of poems there that, in fact, when you published them originally in Shenandoah, they were part of a suite, right? The
Right.
prison
Yeah.
suite, I think it was called. And my guess is that you're getting asked pretty frequently to read the title poem, right? Because that's what everyone does. And I love the title poem, but I'm not going to ask you to read that one.
No problem. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to read the very last poem in the collection, What He Drew in Solitude.
Sure. Yeah.
And I also just want to say this ending poem, the way that it ends is so poignant that I'm not going to say anything else afterward. But if you want to say something to introduce it.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So the final section of the book, What He Did in Solitary, is a bunch of poems on themes of captivity, imprisonment, solitary confinement. These were all written a long time ago. All the poems in this book were written before the pandemic, but ironically and unfortunately, the whole idea of solitary confinement or being locked into a place and not being able to leave took on this new resonance during lockdown. And there's a poem called Virus in here. There's references to vaccines and viruses and things like that. It must have been in the zeitgeist. Who knew? And so then the final three poems are, What He Did in Solitary, What He Dreamed in Solitary, and then finally What He Drew in Solitary. And those were all, as Jane mentioned, they're all part of one poem when they were originally published in 3 sections, and I just kind of put them in their own poem. So this is the poem called What He Drew in Solitary. And incidentally, formally speaking, to refer to the form, every one of these lines is like the super long line. It's like the longest line/sentence of any of the poems in the book. And that's kind of like has this formal interlock with the whole idea of a life sentence or a long sentence or an inappropriately long sentence. Because that's what the form of the poem is. It's a bunch of really, really long sentences, kind of like the sort that prisoners get. So What He Drew in Solitary. An occult chalk outline of his brother on the floor, a gap where his mouth should have gone, for black ants to file through like song notes. Illustrations for a pop-up book for blinded boys. You turn the page and run your fingers airily along a wall. Crooked white fences between himself and despair. 4 finger-length fence posts and a cross slash, repeated all the way around. A single eye on a single brick, his brother keeping watch through an observation slit. Dashed lines of a flea flicker from John Madden football they played as boys. One of those dashed lines wandering off toward the ceiling, X marks the spot. A treasure map from the Chateau d'If to the island of Only. Shin-high sunflowers, seeds stippled with Vicodins. A sun for those sunflowers too, so ghostly pale it turned into a moon at night and made the water level in the toilet bowl subside and rise in tides. A shin-high cross beside the dead-end road where boyhood crashed, killing his brother, leaving him the sole survivor. Cursed to grow into a grown man, slack-limbed on a prison cot. Quadriplegic, unable to stand this. Wanderlust, butane torching ulcers in his flesh, while lust expels itself in chalk dust teardrops on his palm, drawing him deeper into self-erasure, gaunt body, hunted skin, drawn face. Illuminating the scripture of his solitude, in which there is only one God, one way, and that way inward. To the fund of images he draws on, replenished every evening by a distant, indulgent father, making up for his long lostness with these lengths of chalk, these drawings in the dark. Basilica Basquiat's in his brother's nightstick fractured skull, exposed to sunlight by a pipe bomb laid in his boy body's inviolate Vatican. Illustrations, lustrations in the cloister, bareback Jackson Pollock with a penitential whip. here in his cell, in solitary, fighting himself to a draw, drawing sustenance, drawing from the well, drawing his family like a treasure map from memory, drawing in the face of faces turned away forever. Breath, breath, breath. Thank you.
Thank you. So we do have some good questions here. And I don't know if you can see them, but it doesn't matter because I'm happy to read them to you.
Sure.
So the first goes back to that question of language. And it's a question about knowing multiple different tongues. So I'll just go ahead and read it. Since you speak Hindi and Gujarati in addition to English, do you think in English or in the Indian languages you speak when you're writing?
Oh, English, definitely. No question.
And then a couple of questions that have to do with your sort of day job. Specifically, whether it's hard as a poet and a writer to transition from art to the practice of medicine, and particularly whether the sort of precision called upon in medicine is something that gets in the way when you sit down to turn to artistic projects.
Yeah, you know, my job is writing with radiology. And so radiologists, they basically just churn out reports. I've published a bunch of books, but the majority of my writing output is actually radiology reports, just because I read, 16,000 of those a year. And for me, well, actually, I'm not typing them, fortunately. I get to dictate them, and then they get transcribed by the computer interface. So it's not really hard for me to transition back and forth. First of all, because I've been doing this, or rather doing both of these things, literature and medicine, for decades now. Basically, I've always been, my primary formal education has been in the sciences almost exclusively. And my day job, always the sciences. I've never really done anything else. And so, and at the same time, even before I went into the pre-med pathway and all of that, I was always really obsessed with writing, and I was always doing that. And so the multitasking and the parallel tracking of my mind is basically the default now. And that's basic. I don't even process it as switching. I don't even process it as anything. That's just how I roll. And so it's not hard at all. It's not unnatural. As far as the precision that you mentioned, it's interesting because I've actually written about that. I have an essay coming out actually very shortly about this very topic, or partly about this very topic. It's called Sister Disciplines, about science and poetry, science and literature, science and poetry specifically. And I think that precision is actually an advantage to poetic writing, until it becomes too much of an advantage and it segs into something other than poetry. So you have to have a certain amount of ambiguity, and you have to understand the value of ambiguity and how to manipulate it to create a superior effect through your poems. And so it's really good to have close observation and things like that, but you don't want to pin things down too intensely. And so what he did in solitary, what he dreamed in solitary, what he drew in solitary, you don't know the name of the guy who's saying those poems. You don't know where he is. You don't know if he's speaking metaphorically or if he's really in solitary confinement. And that free-floating nature of it, and that ambiguous nature of it, that imprecise nature of it, becomes, it almost increases the valence of the poem. It increases the ways in which that poem can be applied by someone who's reading it. And within that, you can have all sorts of phonetic or imagistic precisions that, so it's kind of like a base of imprecision, and then, the detail work can be very fine. And so that's a dance. But the interesting thing is that being imprecise can often be a virtue, even in radiological writing. And so what's interesting is that when you see like a hazy white area on a chest x-ray, you actually don't know what that is. It could be atelectasis, where the lung is slightly collapsed. It could be a pneumonia. It could be a cancer. It could be, if the person got in a car accident, that could be some blood there, or, you know, contusion of the lung parenchyma. And so when you're actually dictating a radiology report, depending on the circumstances and the appearance, you actually have to put a bunch of possibilities in there in that report. You tell the physician, there's an opacity in the right lower lobe. Given the clinical circumstances, this could be atelectasis, infiltrate, contusion, mass, or some combination thereof, you know, and radiologists are notorious for keeping things open-ended so that we don't get pinned down to one thing, so that a lawyer doesn't come to us and say, you said it was atelectasis and it turned out to be pneumonia and this, that, the other. So radiologists are like well known for actually being imprecise. And so that's kind of like the funny thing, which is that both as a radiologist and as a poet, I'm always navigating precisions and imprecisions in order to tell the truth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So a couple of questions here about other writers. Mm-hmm. And a question about, and this is the kind of question that whenever I encounter it, I start panicking, but maybe you won't. What book or author has inspired you the most?
That doesn't panic me at all, because I have a certain like top tier of books, and they're probably very predictable to anybody who kind of follows my work. The Gita is one of them. I translated that, and that is kind of like the operating system for my brain. And so that's there. I mean, it's so much in the groundwater at this point. I don't even regard it as like a book, like other books, you know? So that one, you can just take that for granted. And then again, I have an uninteresting and perhaps obvious answer, which is that Shakespeare, basically. I was going through, we were cleaning out the garage earlier today, and I found this book that I self-published when I was 17 years old called Entrance. And like over half of the book, it's like over half of the book is basically, well, the first part of the book is like Emily Dickinson impersonations. Mm-hmm. And then over half of the book is blank verse tragedies in the manner of Shakespeare. So I've been obsessed with that, with those two poets in particular, mm-hmm. since like my teenage years. And, you know, those two are just, they're there. They're so important to me. And I still go back to them every once in a while. And it's like going home. Like, it makes me kind of happy to go back into some Shakespeare play that I don't remember, or just randomly open up to a Emily Dickinson poem. Like, they were there, and I think they represent the two extremes of my poetic practice, where, you know, Emily Dickinson's really solitary and kind of mystical and intense, and then Shakespeare's kind of garrulous and talkative and kind of inhabits a lot of voices a lot of people, inhabits a lot of perspectives. And that kind of like those are the two kind of limits of the spectrum of what you can do as a poet. Yeah. And so everything I do strives ideally towards one or the other, and then I end up somewhere in the middle, mm-hmm. of having some elements of hermetic, personal, and mystical poetry, and then I sometimes lapse into garrulous, multi-perspective, extemporizations and dramatic poetry like that. So yeah, those are my touchstones for sure.
Yeah. So since we're talking about Emily Dickinson here, there is a real Emily Dickinson-y poem in the book, His Vision.
Oh yeah.
Would you read that? It's on page 61.
Sure. What was it, 61 you said? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that poem could have gone in Dothead. I wrote it so long ago. And I don't know why I didn't put it in Dothead. I don't know why I didn't put it in that other one. I have like a little file of poems that I've published before, and then they just kind of like chill there. And then I sometimes will go into it and be like, oh, let me pop this in right here. But anyway, I salvaged this one from like oblivion. And now I'm reading it to all of you. It's called His Vision. I never saw the root of the real in arboreal flare, nor witness this man walk on water, nor that one float in air. I sat beneath the Bodhi tree. I felt my body itch. Between the true cup and the false, I knew not which was which. My eyes have never blown like fuses, sparked black upon a wall. No surge of sight or insight mine, no whisper and no call. My thousand suns have been my twins, my Beatrice, my wife. My way to immortality, the living of the life. No visage singed into a shroud or knotted in a tree. A newborn in a swaddling cloth was the vision given me. Someday the faces round my sickbed will blur and superimpose. Into that single human face, the visionaries know. My humble human loves collected, and for the first time seen intensely, their diffraction narrowed to a beam.
Thank you. All right, so one more question, and then actually we have one more request for a poem.
Sure.
Which is the first one in the collection. And since you read the last one, it seems fitting that you should read the
Sure.
first one. But we'll hold off on that for just a second. This question is also just about the contents of this book. And specifically whether any of these poems were written after March 2020 and after the pandemic, or whether they all were prior to that.
They're all prior. Publication has this really long lead time. And so, you know, you get a book accepted like years ago, and then it comes out and you're kind of like, ah, yes, I remember writing you. And you know, so there's just a long lead time in that industry. And so, yeah, nothing in this book was written after the pandemic. I've written some stuff after the pandemic and about the pandemic, which you can find online. I think the most widely read one was called Antiviral Cocktail. So if you type in Antiviral Cocktail, you'll find that poem, which I wrote in the thick of it. And yeah, everything is written before, but yet a lot of things have weird resonances with it. And I think that, truth be told, even Dothead has something called pandemic guzzle in it that refers to New York City. It refers to like vascular problems with the virus. It refers to all sorts of stuff. And I think a lot of this stuff was in the zeitgeist. We kind of tell ourselves that we're surprised by it, but you can go back in the archives of the internet and see people warning about this very thing for a very long time. Way back at the turn of the century, people have been talking about this and writing books about it. And we still got caught off guard just because it's not something that we have very much experience with even for the past 100 years. So unfortunately, that's just how it worked out. But yeah, everything is from a couple years back. And I got a whole nother, book with the current pandemic poems in it. I'm just waiting, ready to go. So you'll see that eventually. But by then you'll have forgotten everything because it'll be like 2020 something and you'll be like, oh, wait, didn't really, yeah. But so who knows what else will have happened between then and now to make us forget what we've gone through this year. Let's hope that this is the peak of it.
Does that one have a working title yet?
Titanium Nightingale. That's what it is. I'm pretty sure I'm going to call it that. I like that phrase for some reason. I think if you dismantle that phrase into its component syllables and consonants, there's like an internal music with that Titanium Nightingale thing that I don't think I'm going to come up with anything better than that. So,
so stick with it.
I'm going to stick with it.
All right. So to end tonight's adventure, will you read the first poem in the collection, The Adventures of Amit?
With pleasure. So yeah, this is about it's the Adventures of Amit Majmudar. I grew up right here in the Midwest. I've never actually lived very long outside of Ohio. Briefly lived in New York City for about 6 months when I was born in New York City, and then we moved right to Ohio. But then we went to India for about 1.5 years and came right back to Ohio. And so Midwest is where I'm at, is where I've always been. It's home. And so this is a very Midwestern poem, and it's about being a bookish Midwestern kid, I guess. And it refers to like, Mark Twain, his sort of novels of adventurous boyhood, which is definitely not what I was like growing up. So this is called The Adventures of Amit Majmudar. Never laid a snare for nothing. Never caught a bullfrog. Broke my slingshot wishbone wishing. Never had a smoke. Never clipped a baseball card to thutter in the spokes. My fist clenched an ink pen, and I learned what to think when. And never swore no honest Injun, and never spat and never struck. Where you gone, Tom? Where you at, Huck? I call myself a man today, though I've never been a boy, and dug for treasure in the woods or lost myself in play, feared dead for 7 days until I showed up by my grave and made a sniffling town rejoice. I could have been a pirate, Mama, at least a Robin Hood, but I was always up to something employable and good. And now I'm down here in this cave, crying to be saved, though I reckon I am stuck. Where you gone, Tom? Where you at, Huck? Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. With that, we are going to give the reins back to Linda. But thank you so much, Amit.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Linda, and thank you, Gramercy Books. Thank you so much. This is just such a great honor and great opportunity.
Thank you both. Your probing questions, Jane, and the poetry we heard tonight, Amit, is extraordinary. I encourage all of you in the audience to tell your friends about Amit's new book, such a wonderful collection that is worth turning to time and again. So thank you again, Amit and Jane, for an inspiring and illuminating hour. As one of the viewers wrote in the chat tonight, and there was a lot of chatting, tonight was both amazing and wonderful, she said. So thank you so much. Thanks also to all of you for joining us this evening and for your thought-provoking questions. I want to remind you of the links in the chat box with the registration if you'd like to upcoming Zoom Live programs, one on October 7th featuring Robert Feisler's Tinderbox, The Untold Story of the Upstairs Lounge Fire and the Rise of Gay Liberation, and also the October 15th program featuring poet Maggie Smith and Saeed Jones in conversation. We've also added a link if you'd like to purchase another copy for What He Did in Solitary for your parent, husband, wife, sibling, or friend. Want to remind you also, Gramercy Books is now open daily from 10 to 6. We continue to provide curbside pickup. You can just call when you arrive and we bring out your order. Thank you again for spending part of your evening with us, and we hope that you'll join us again soon.